So here in counters component, this is where we have the state, the list of counters, as well as the methods that modify or mutate the state, such as handle increment, handle reset, and handle delete. We should move the state as well as all the methods that modify the state from this component to its parent, that is app component. So I'm going to select all this code here, cut it, go back to app component, and paste it right here. That was the first step. Now, back in counters component, here we have a reference to this that handle reset. But this method no longer exists in this class. Now it's part of its parent. So we need to pass it down using props. So back in app component, let's look at the render method. This is where we have our counters component. We want to modify this to raise events such as on reset, on delete, and on increment. So on reset, we set this to this that handle reset. On increment, we set this to this that handle increment. And on delete, which we set to this that handle delete. So these are the three events that are raised by this component, and here are the corresponding handlers that belong to the app component. Now let's go back to counters component. So we should change this expression to this that props that on reset, because that's the name of the property that we set on the prop object. So one more time, here in app component, these are the properties of the prop object, right? Now, one more time, back in counters component, we should also update the reference to handle delete and handle increment. So one more time, this dot props dot on delete and this dot props dot on increment. Basically, what is happening here is that this counter component raises the delete event, and here we're bubbling that event to our parent. So we're not handling that event in this component, we're simply bubbling it up to the parent of this component. And one last change we need to make here, since we no longer have the state in this component, we need to pass the list of counters via props. So we should change this to this dot props dot counters, and also back in app component, we should pass the list of counters right here. We set this to this dot state dot counters. So now this counters component is a controlled component because it doesn't have any state. It simply receives data and methods to modify the data via props. So it's entirely controlled by its parent. So this is how we lift the state. Now let's test the application and make sure everything is working. So let's increment a couple of these, then reset them, delete a couple of them. Beautiful. Finally, we need to display the total number of counters here on the navigation bar. So here in app component, we're passing our counters to our counters component. Similarly, we can pass this array to our navigation bar component. So we can pass either the counters array or just the total number of counters. So the nav bar itself doesn't have to do the calculations. We can simply give it a number. So total counters, we set it to this, that state, that counters, dot length. Or we could take this to the next level and filter only the counters with value greater than 0. So we get counters, filter them where counter.value is greater than 0, and then we'll get the total number of those counters. So save the changes. Now let's go to navbar component. This is where we have the label. Right after that, I want to add a span with a few classes like badge, badge-pill, and badge-secondary. Here we render this.props.total counters like this. Save the changes. and back in the browser. So currently we have only one counter with value greater than 0. Let's increment the second counter. Now the value is updated to 2. If we delete the first counter, the total number of counters is updated accordingly. So we lifted up the state from the counters component to its parent, which is the app component. Now we can share this state with the children of this component via props. And with this technique, we have multiple components in sync.